Hi, my name is Kelvin Newman and welcome to the Brighton SEO podcast, where we share talks from one of the world's most popular search and marketing conferences. The event started out as a few people meeting in an upstairs room of a pub and is now attended by over 3,000 people from all over the world. This episode is a recording of one of the speakers at a recent event.
So without further ado, put your hands together. Daniel.
Hello everyone, welcome to Brighton SEO. I hope you've been having a great morning so far. It's my 6th year here, so I'm really privileged to be standing up in front of you all today presenting on something that hopefully should be quite fascinating from looking at a different angle of it. So I'm Daniel Moore and I work at a company called Mindshare, and we are one of the largest digital marketing agencies in the UK. And what I'd like to talk to you all about today is the hidden potential of brand PPC. Now, you might be sat there wondering why I'm going to talk to you all about brand PPC, because it's something that you probably all deal with in your everyday roles, and you might think that there's nothing new to learn there. But hopefully there's a few nuggets in this presentation that you might take away with and just make that everyday role just that little bit easier. But how hidden is the potential of brand PPC? Well, it's about as hidden as a 3-year-old trying to play hide and seek. That's my little boy there trying to pretend to me that he's asleep, and he clearly is not. So I've tried to just split up today's talk into 4 key sections, and I want to kind of kick it off really with trying to get everyone to understand why brand PPC warrants more of your valuable time. Secondly, I wanted to highlight some competitor bidding scenarios that you may have faced before or potentially might face in the future. Thirdly, I want to run through a couple of case studies that I have just to kind of bring some of the data to light. And last but not least, highlight how this can be utilized for you in your business. So, I wanted to get a Scarface meme in here, and this is how it happened. But just like Scarface, you want what's coming to you. And the reason why I think that this is important within brand PPC is because when people search for your brand, you naturally expect that click. If people obviously have some kind of affiliation with you and your brand, you obviously want to get that traffic. That's obviously the whole point of paid search and specifically brand PPC. However, just because somebody has searched for your brand, it doesn't mean that they have any real affiliation to your brand at that particular moment in time. It just means that they've probably heard about you in one shape or form. So perhaps they've heard about you through some kind of offline media. Maybe they've seen a TV ad or seen you in a newspaper or something like that. And they've just searched for you. So at this particular moment in time, there's no divine right that you actually warrant that click. But where you actually want to get that customer to is through the kind of traditional customer funnel here. So as I mentioned, at this moment in time, they're aware of your brand. They're at that first stage within that cycle. But moving on, your aim is not just to get them to purchase. And in particular, from an AdWords point of view, you obviously want to get them to get that click. However, moving on, your real aim is actually to get them to become a customer advocate and to kind of preach your brand name moving forwards. But they're not an advocate just yet. So we can't just expect them to go preaching your brand name. But how do you do that? How do you get people to get to the stage where they're talking about your brand in a really positive light? Well, one thing that you have to do is not take advice from this guy, because you need to stand out from the crowd. And that's what the talk is all about today. And I just kind of wanted to end this intro with hopefully quite a good example that might reflect some of the things that I'll kind of go on to talk about later on. So you probably have seen this example before, but if you haven't, it's probably one of the best, I think, in my opinion, in terms of that whole competitive landscape from a brand perspective. So the user here, the user searched for the query iPhone 6S. And you've got Samsung, who have delivered a really fantastic ad, not just in terms of the position. Obviously, you know, they're kind of position 1 in this instance. But if you look at the copy here, it's really nice, it's bespoke, it's tailored, and a lot of the things that we go on to talk about later all reflects around this, and essentially trying to grab attention, but more importantly, trying to grab clicks. And that's kind of where we're going to move on to later on. So as I mentioned, I've got a few bits and pieces from a case study that I think hopefully will just reflect where I'm going to go onto with this talk. But we had a problem. So the site in question here is a comparison website. So one of the things that we looked at here is essentially the last 12 months of the data. You can clearly see that the average cost per click has skyrocketed. Alarm bells obviously started to ring, and we had to look into the data. But prior to that, it was all relatively flat. There are obviously going to be peaks and troughs, but generally speaking, it's really quite a recent trend in this particular set of data. And at the peak, the cost per click was 5.4 times the cheapest CPC during that period. So quite a substantial increase here. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, you might have just increased your visibility during this time period, and that's kind of where the cost increases come from. But actually, we can kind of see here that that's not the case. So I've just plotted that across the average position, just to kind of give you an indicative factor as to what's going on here. And you can see that that line there, that light purple line, that's quite flat. So that's not been the case. So what happens? Well, as digital marketers, what do we do when we don't understand something? We've got to go back and look at the data. We need to analyze it, looking back at the history, and then from there, we can kind of collect ourselves and understand what it is that's happening. So that's exactly what we did. So looking at the next stage, really, is at this point of view, we kind of first dived into the Auction Insights report, and also we had a few competitor tools to look into as well, which, of course, there are lots of different ones out in the market. But the Auction Insights is always a really, really great place to go as well. And here, essentially, during the exact same time period of where that CPC graph starts to spike, that's exactly where you can see the number of competitors starts to spike at pretty much the exact same moment in time. So it looks like there's a very, very clear correlation between the two there. However, you don't just want to look at the volume of competitors. We also need to understand essentially the velocity of the kind of aggressiveness, if you will, of those competitors. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. So what this chart shows is the total impressions by month for the brand query in question. So, for example, looking at the number of brand queries from competitors by understanding the total number of searches taking place for that brand, and then getting the search impression share for those competitors, and then essentially combining that data to kind of say, all of my competitors, are they being more or less visible than my own brand? So plotting that across the chart here, we actually end up finding that towards May 2017 here, the total number of impressions from those competitors exceeds our own brand impressions. So naturally, this is when we kind of felt like it was the final straw, really. Just looking at it from a slightly different angle here, and similar chart, but just looking at it from a more impression share perspective. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because I think it's quite intuitive in terms of identifying and put it into perspective how many ads there are at any given time. So here, it will actually reach approximately 120% impression share, which essentially means that for every single time our ad is being served during a brand query, there are going to be approximately 1.2 competitor ads. Now, if that sinks in, then that's a lot of competition for something where, going back to my earlier slide, really you feel like the customer should be clicking on your ad in the first place. And because of how much this has increased, there's a potential this could increase further. So you need to nip it in the bud and see what can happen before it starts to progress and obviously have some kind of detrimental impact on your business. And last but not least, just wanted to kind of raise the point of the number of variables at play here. Obviously, there's lots of different variables within AdWords and CPCs, but just plotting it against the correlation, I just wanted to pick out ones that are the most significant from the charts that we've just looked at. And from here, essentially anything that has a correlation that's nearer to 1 shows that it's positive and significantly positive, i.e. if, for example, we have here, if the total competitor impression share is 0.92 there, then essentially the average CPC should, in theory, increase as the total competitor share increases as well. So we have total competitor impression share, the number of competitors in the auction, and the total competitor impressions. All three of them are statistically significant. So when they increase, that's going to be bad news, essentially, for our average CPC. So just things to watch out for, really. And obviously, now we've got a lot of data, but what do we do with it? We need to find some way of bucking the trend because it's getting really, really expensive for us. And hopefully some of this will be applicable to all of your business because what we've got here, I've got 3 different options, some of which worked for us and some of which didn't. But I think the point around brand PPC and specifically around the competition aspect of things is that every single market is different. In one market, you might know the competitors. You might actually be, working very, very closely with them. And in the instance of what we have here, comparison websites are actually the closest competitors for us, are actually our closest partners because you have to work together in order to offer prices, for example. So this might be a little bit more unique, but everyone can kind of take this and hopefully kind of adapt it to your own businesses. Option number 1 here is the quickest and easiest option. And it's just to simply contact the competitors. And as I say, it depends on how well you know them, but this is typically the first place that you can consider going. In terms of looking at this, I think that it's always good to just understand where the market is in terms of the people that you work with and the other websites. Obviously, this is not the case for all scenarios. However, from my personal experience, looking at sites that you work with, perhaps they're partners, perhaps they're affiliates, or just perhaps they're websites that work with you in one shape or form or another. And if they were to turn around and say, okay, we can suddenly increase the number of sales that we're providing to you by tomorrow, it probably means that they're going to put more money into PPC. And if that's the case, then that might just be able to drive up the sales volume for them, but also it's going to potentially drive up the cost per click for you. So actually, is that really what you want? And you just kind of need to have a think about that, really. And just splitting it out for when it is that you should be using this kind of tactic and when it might be potentially applicable to you. As I mentioned, the big pro here is this because it's so easy to do. And if you've got a really, really good relationship with the people in that market, then great. So as I say, as a comparison site, it worked quite well for us to some extent. But really, the big con is that it's just like poker. If you play poker, you're essentially showing your hand. And that's exactly what you're doing here. Because if you were to turn around to a competitor and essentially you're saying to them, look, guys, this is really hurting me. Clearly our average CPC is increasing. You don't want them to have one over on you. You don't want them to have that kind of information because what are they going to do with it? They might turn around and say, okay, fine, it was a genuine mistake. Maybe they're new to PPC and they've got some kind of broad match on or something like that. Maybe they haven't got enough negative keywords on it. And it might be a genuine mistake. However, if it's not and they are actively trying to bid on you, you giving them that information might just fuel them. And if anything, actually might make them want to target you even more. Speaking of targeting and breaking that even more, option 2 is to bid back. So this is essentially following through on option 1. So if they were to turn around and say, okay, we want to bid on you, we're not going to stop bidding on you, then potentially you might want to bid back. But just like in Warriors, all this might do is antagonize your competitors. I think from a kind of business point of view, but also from a kind of emotional personality perspective as well, it might rile them up and make them specifically want to go after you. And that's never a good mix. So it's just something to be very, very wary of there. And really, for me, that's the big con here. You don't want to start a bidding war. Nobody really wins in a bidding war. Your CPCs are going to increase. If you're bidding on their brand terms, their brand CPC is going to increase. Everyone's paying more. Everyone's CPA is going to increase. But you're probably going to get the same amount of sales. So what's the benefit to anyone? It's no benefit to you. It's no benefit to them. So you need to find a way around it. And this might not be the right way. However, the pro is that if you weren't to follow through, then they might still continue bidding on your brand terms. So then it might be a very kind of biased relationship in terms of they're bidding on you and you're not bidding on them. So you could potentially be losing sales. And again, very much depending on the market, but I have seen scenarios where people who bid on the competitor brand terms, the CPAs sometimes are actually very, very manageable and actually quite comparable in terms of your own account. So it can work, but it very much depends on the type of audience that it is you're going after. And that kind of brings me on to my final point around when it is that you might want to use it. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this in a lot of scenarios. However, when the competitor is not going to back down, they're going to continue bidding on you, and you're in some kind of market where customers are quite elastic in terms of price. So they're more liable, essentially, to switch rather than become that kind of advocate that we mentioned earlier. That might be a good place for you to kind of come in with a good offer, a good proposition of some kind, and say, hey, you were looking for these guys, but you haven't heard of us just yet. So come over here and we can kind of give you what you need. So that might be one place where you can kind of consider using this sort of strategy. And that brings me on to my third and final option. And this, for me, is going to be the best option for the vast majority of you. And that's just to focus on you. And what I mean by this is to almost kind of block out what's happening in the market to some extent. Not necessarily ignore it, but just to focus on what's going on in your own account. Try and increase the click-through and essentially try and kind of squeeze that competitor out. And I'll just go into a little bit of detail as to exactly what I mean by that. So hopefully this gives a little bit of information as to how we can get there. And how I've tried to divide this is because I feel like the campaign structure is always at the heart of everything that you do from a PPC point of view, whether that's brand PPC or not. Because it's all well and good trying to increase the click-through and increase the optimization for all of the other sections. So, for example, here you've got visibility, creative, and extensions. Great, they do work. However, if you don't have the campaign structure that lets you really hone in on the data, lets you understand the data to the level that you need, then what good are all of these going to be? You might increase the click-through right now, that's great, but then it might always have that glass ceiling. So I'm going to kind of kick it off really by just diving into the campaign restructure, and hopefully it'll all make a bit more sense from there. So onto that, there's obviously been a lot of talks before, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of talks after mine about how to restructure your campaign. So I'm just going to kind of dip my toe in the water, and there's lots of articles obviously that you can read online about that as well. But for me, the campaign structure is so fundamental, mainly because of how important data is in this day and age. And in order to understand where it is that you need to optimize and improve your account in order to get those customers and stand out for the crowd, you need a structure that really follows what your website or what your business and brand is all about. So for example, if you are an international brand and you make maybe different commission models in the UK versus the rest of Europe, why would you have them all in the same campaign? You wouldn't. It doesn't make any sense. If you're making sort of twice the money that you are in the UK as you are in Spain, for instance, then why would you have the same bid for the same keyword? It doesn't make any sense. You want to then be bidding higher proportionally for the UK because you know that you make more money there. So your campaign structure might look something like that. If you are a retailer, you might want to have a campaign structure that reflects your website in terms of how you've divvied up your product set, for example. So there's lots of different ways to do it. There's no one size fits all, but it's just something to have a little think about. And next time you have a look at your account, maybe just have your website on a different tab and just kind of have a look at them side by side. And the way that you do that is just to better understand the data. And once you've got the data, then you can really, really hone in on those other three elements that we'll just jump into. And from there, that's where you can start to improve your overall visibility. And again, just talking about the data. So once you've got better data, you can understand how the queries differ. So in the scenario that I've got here, we found that people who looked for comparison had a completely different mindset to people who were looking for compare queries, even though they sound very, very similar, and you might not think it. But because of the way that we'd broken it out, it was really, really useful to us. So then I could increase the visibility for comparison and not necessarily do the same for compare. And then it really helped us in terms of the kind of CPAs, which we just jump into. Again, creative, everyone knows this, but obviously the better the creative, the more click-through you're going to have, better quality scores, lower CPCs, et cetera, et cetera. Breaking it out so that ad groups have no more than maybe 5 keywords or so in it, and it's very, very bespoke to that keyword set. It's just going to help you no end there. And last but not least, extensions. Very, very similar, but here I guess the main thing to point out is around maybe site links in particular, I think, because if you look at your data and you've got a number of queries that tell you something about that customer, you can use extensions to your advantage. So for example here, if you find that in your query set, it's saying, okay, people are looking for the word login. Okay, great. If they're looking for login, you know that they're a customer already, in which case, why don't you then send them either straight to that login page, or maybe within your site links, you can start to offer them different landing pages that might serve the need of that content. Offer pages perhaps, or some kind of loyalty, refer a friend, that kind of thing. And all of these things combined, as I say, they're just going to squeeze the competitors out and hopefully reduce the charts that we were seeing earlier in terms of how many competitors are in that market at that given time. And we've kind of gone through this already, but essentially, overall, this is probably the best strategy to use. However, one thing to bear in mind is that you just need the level of expertise within your company or an agency or somebody that it may be that you're using at the time, because it's going to take some time to make sure the account is looking as healthy as it can be. And if you don't have that level of expertise, then you potentially could actually be doing more harm than good. And in terms of when to do it, it's probably best to do it in an off-peak period, because then you can increase the velocity and kind of optimization essentially during peak trading time. So, taking all this into account, I'm just going to jump back into the case study that we saw earlier. And what was the result? Well, we implemented all three of those tactics during a number of months, with varying kind of degrees of success, really. But the one that really stands out is the restructuring. And as you can see here, the restructure took place, and immediately the average CPC dropped. And it actually dropped by the greatest amount in just under 3 years. So instant success after the few months there. Same happened with click-through. A few months straight after, we ended up getting the best click-through that we've had in the entire time of the account, which was just over 10 years. So all in all, my kind of conclusion here is to look at your brand account and don't necessarily aim for good, try and aim for great. If you look at your quality scores, you've maybe got an 8 out of 10, that doesn't mean that you can't get any better. So just go back, have a look at your accounts, and hopefully there's a few bits and pieces in here that might be able to help you optimize and make your job just a little bit easier. And that's me, so thank you for your time. I hope that's been useful.
This was originally recorded at a Brighton SEO conference. If you want to listen to more episodes or find out about the conference itself, you can do at brightonseo.com.